Yeah, so one thing that I've been working on sort of in my time side time over the past couple months is taking a look at our documentation and trying to see avenues for making the documentation and Parsl in general more accessible to outsiders. Because it doesn't go without saying, perhaps, or could go without saying since I'm giving this presentation talk, that I really like Parsl, and I think it's got a lot of features for why others should like it, particularly other scientists. You can run basically anything you want in parallel. I can retool Parsl to run on I have any of the systems I have access to. It works as well with existing Python codes as existing Python modules, if not better. Anything I can do with concurrent.futures, I can do with Parsl. And it's got a bunch of advanced features that let me do um, unique things to try to publish interesting CS papers. So all of these are how I see Parsl, but these are not the eyes that I think most of our users come to the Parsl documentation with in mind. Like instead of being need to solve that I can run anything in parallel, what they need to know is how can they run an app? Um, I can make claims that you can retool Parsl to run anywhere, and we've got documentation pages explaining all of the different providers, but we are not as clear on defining what a simple configuration object is. Um, Integrating Parsl inside of a library is something that we've learned how to do on the fly over the past couple years of Parsl being existing. And recently we added some documentation pages explaining how new folks can learn the lessons that we have when developing a new science capability with Parsl in mind. And while I enjoy many of Parsl's advanced features, I'm very curious about the ones we were just discussing at the beginning of this call around file staging. That's not what people need to know immediately. So I think we need a documentation that um, allows people to be able to understand what they need to know first before they can be in a place where using those advanced features will be their main problem. And you may have inferred by the way I'm describing this, I don't think our documentation at present meets that. So what I wanted to do today, semi-formally, is to talk through what my gripes about the Parsl documentation are, show you what my plan for action has been. Part of my process of preparing these slides today was actually articulating a plan down. So I want you to be here to help me review that. By going through where we're sitting now, we can talk through some of the past pull requests I've made, which I know at least Ben and Yadu and Andrew Rosen have seen. But I figure this community call is a place we can ensure that we can get the kind of feedback that will really help make the documentation good. So at this point, I know we're soon going to be at a stage to elicit comments. So I'll start by saying my gripes, and we can see how well these sit with the overall team. So I read a lot of scientific documentation, or sorry, that is documentation for science-related codes, and Parsl breaks my expectations for what I hope to see in a documentation at many points. So on left is an example from TensorFlow, sorry, not TensorFlow, PyTorch, and on right is Parsl. Now, what I see as different about these two, on the left, we have a short set of paragraphs of one or two sentences each, with a clear topic statement up at the beginning of the section, such that it's very easy to skim through this, understand if I need to read it in depth or not, kind of like what one sees in a newspaper. Whereas on Parsl, we've got a lot of detailed information, which is not in itself a bad thing, but it's not at the level that we want for an initial user. We introduce a lot of advanced concepts all at the same time. Additionally, it doesn't feature the links to outgoing codes where people who might not have heard the word, for example, MKL, or I don't know if our example, yeah, Slurm and HT Condor are examples in the Parsl on the right, to be able to click on that and be able to help build up the language that we as people who are more familiar with workflows in general and Parsl in specific already know. So in short, to wrap this up, documentation is too verbose and doesn't have a clear target at someone who is just getting into Parsl. There are also other kind of more structural issues with the documentation. Like when I look at the NumPy documentation, it's very clear where I should get started on this. The initial first steps getting started, clearly delineated. The fundamentals and usage are broken up into clear topics. There's onboarding sections for people coming from different common patterns. Like I actually learned how to use NumPy from that NumPy for MATLAB users page. Whereas with Parsl, there isn't as clear of an overall structure and order. The overview section goes from starting with a very kind of simple model of explaining what concurrency is, all the way through things that I'm not entirely sure I understand or need to, like the service environment. That feels like more of an advanced topic. So here, this is just another illustrate something about our documentation that if we were to take some time and restructure it such that it's easy for dropping people into, reordering the sections, grouping them clearly between very introductory, beginner, and advanced would give the people an ability to onboard with Parsl that I think is only limited at the moment. So with that said, maybe I'll pause here before getting into my kind of plan of action. Anyone feel strong objections to what I'm describing here? Or have you also felt that the documentation is at a point where we should refactor it?
Yeah, I agree with pretty much what you're saying. One
Same.
specific thing, if you go back maybe 2 slides,
Mhm.
that
This
that
one
one,
or
the
oh,
contemporary,
yeah.
yeah, that one. Like one thing, a lot of the history of this documentation has felt like it's written by people who are used to writing CS papers,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that has been
And
my impression.
that text on the right reads like that.
May well have been copy and pasted from a CS.
Yeah, right. Like that's the background. That's the history, right? Is there was a CS paper and that's what we were writing in 2018.
Yeah. Now that Kyle, I didn't want to point fingers until Kyle showed up, but hi, Kyle.
I'll put my
Um,
fingers at
I
Kyle anytime.
figure now that we've got sort of more of the folks, because this was all of this was written well before I knew what a workflow engine was. So I've been
Yeah.
intentionally not critical, but now that I go back with an eye.
I think as well, it's a lot of different people supplying. I mean, the bit there's overlap and duplication. I know Ian came and wrote all that overview stuff, which I'm sure has overlap with some of the other bits and what have you. So I agree entirely with what you said, Logan. I particularly like the example that was much more like user focused with questions like, I want to get started, that sort of thing. Help guide people through the docs rather than I want a 10-page paper about the world of workflow. Yeah.
Okay. Then I'm glad we're all at sort of a similar mind on this. And I do want to emphasize that, yeah, I'm excited by the fact that we have a product or a code together at a point where we can refactor the documentation, because I imagine all of this was written well in advance. And I know I contributed to the bloat on the configuration section by just sort of pasting stuff in willy-nilly. So it did want to emphasize here that while I'm pointing out specific issues, I'm not trying to criticize people, even though I did start off by introducing Kyle by suggesting I wanted to blame him for everything. That's just fun. All right. So that's where I am. These are sort of the guiding roles that I've been trying to do incrementally since I work on Parsl on the weekends or on a day off when I feel like doing something that I'm not getting paid for. Because unfortunately, I don't have Parsl specific funding at Argonne. And that's sort of taken going back through the commit history, has been actually about a year and a half of effort, which even though it's about a year and a half, it's only 4 commits, or sorry, not 4 commits, 4 pull requests. But hopefully especially now that I've written out a plan of where I'm going, will be something that I can have enough certainty on to plow away comfortably at. So what I wanted to do here was to just outline specific goals after highlighting these sort of general concepts of what I'm going for. We can go back and dive into any of the specific pull requests in general, knowing that they haven't seen a full team looking at them, presumably. But I especially, if anything to do today, want to get to point 8. Anything else that people have been uncomfortable with in the documentation that if I get some time, I can dedicate some effort towards. That's the number 1 priority. And the number 2, I'm working on a pull request now that I just brought up in draft this morning that is bigger than I originally thought it was going to be. That was part of my motivation in putting a talk together today, knowing that having some synchronous time to discuss its objectives could be beneficial. But with that said, does that sound like a good use of everybody's time?
Yep.
All right. Excellent. So I started the first 2 by focusing on the
Logan,
areas.
sorry,
Please
just
go
before
ahead.
you go on, I think everything that you've said up to this point has been great. I agree with these points. I guess the thing I was wondering about is, in some ways, we're talking about things that are going to make Parsl easier for a new user, or somebody that's not as experienced, and we don't seem to actually have any of those here. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering, how do we kind of what is your plan for kind of knowing that your changes are successful, kind of with the caveat that probably none of us can fully verify that.
Yeah, no, that is a great question. I have not thought about how to actually test any of these documentation changes. Now, just spitballing, the way that I've done them in the past for codes that I've been working more synchronously on is whenever I get a specific user complaint, like I don't understand this. I go and I fix it in the documentation, and then I tell them to read the documentation, see if it answers their question. Of course, emphasizing that if it doesn't, I'll help them fix that. Now, I don't know if we have that model. I've been watching the Parsl help to see if people have questions that align with areas of the documentation, but that's sort of accidental to get user feedback. Do we have any sort of file new PhD students
I
who were
was going to
teaching
say
Parsl?
the students might be our best bet.
Yeah. Yeah, 1, getting them familiar with Parsl seems like a win. And 2, using their unfamiliarity to help us.
Yeah.
Seems like it could help both.
Yeah, I guess I was just saying that because it seems like that maybe that's part of the timeline would be, not just making all these changes, but thinking about how we make sure that they're useful.
Excellent. Spoken to someone with a lot of experience with the CSSI program. Yeah, so I'm going to quickly jot a note on that. Excuse me for pulling out my notepad. Oh, and another thing I could do is enlist Christine. Yeah, because some of her docs explain concepts in Parsl, so I know that she's been thinking about the same kind of questions we're discussing here. And I don't know if Christine's on the call.
One
Yeah.
thing
No Christine today.
One thing we've done before, Logan, when we did docs for Globus, was we tried to identify the different roles of people that came to our docs and tried to separate paths for them. Like the path for a Christine is potentially quite different than the path for a Logan or some sort of science user that comes in. So having a pathway for administrator is supporting Parsl on their environment versus scientist wants to get science done. I don't know what other roles we may have.
Yeah,
Just something to consider. I don't know how different they would be. Maybe someone who wants to use Parsl to run a bag of tasks is different than someone who wants to build a new service. I don't know.
I guess the one other thing I was gonna say, kind of related or building on Logan's point, sorry, not yours, Kyle, is the fact that we do have a few HPC centers that are either using or supporting Parsl in some way. Maybe we should be trying to see if the people there also are kind of happy with these changes beyond the grad students.
Well, it's interesting because a lot of they've done a lot of their own stuff, right? They've built their own docs around this, and then they point strategically at our docs. So maybe making those pointer bits a little bit easier for them. What are the bits they really want to point at? Anyway, it's a good point.
Well, I mean, we'll definitely have to coordinate with them if they're pointing into our docs, and we're going to change our docs then.
There's another thing, Dan, if we were thinking about like another sustainability like proposal, this would be probably a big thing to write about, like a complete restructure of docs. So I am very scared. The more Logan talks about this, I'm just incredibly scared how on earth we can boil the ocean like this.
Yeah. No, it's a big subject. And as you see, for me, it's a year and a half in the making of like finding time for it. But yeah, I'll defer to those who know more about if there's an opportunity for finding funded effort time.
It's not clear that there's an opportunity for finding funded effort for anything at this point, but
Yeah.
that's a different issue. So yeah, so Logan, probably you should go on. Sorry, I didn't mean to distract you from the specific things.
Oh no, it was a fantastic question. Thank you, Dan. But yeah, so I'll maybe give an idea about sort of what the scope of the changes are to lead up to why this one is a little bit of an outlier. So Logan of 2023 focused on only changing existing pages, not introducing new ones. For instance, we have this app page. Sorry that I'm showing you the GitHub here. I figured that was a good common language for everyone on this call, but hopefully it won't be particularly bad for the YouTube. I didn't think of that in advance. But what I did here was I tried to overall reduce the amount of text in the application, or sorry, the apps part of the user guide, and introduce very specific rules that people could follow. Like if you're building a Python function and you're someone who hasn't run anything in parallel, what are the rules that you need to follow? Like Parsl's thing about imports, like why serializing a function means you need to repeat the inputs or the imports on the inside of the function. So I try to distill these down into very digestible rules. Global variables are bad. Thinking that that would be a way of making the software kind of more understandable. So a lot of the information is already in the documentation. Sort of phase one on the changes was to ensure that it's put in a very succinct way. Moving forward, I've started changing broader things about the overall documentation. For instance, I've now taken the overall structure and tried to bring some more kind of ability to dive into it from a high level. So for instance, in this, I should probably just go to the Parsl documentation page. I took what was a flat hierarchy of many different single documentation files, like configuring was at its own level. It was at the same level as data and exceptions, which are both more advanced topics. And I restructured the documentation to make something like configuring at a higher level in the documentation such that it was more easily visible and a clearer entry point for people to access the documentation. So if we go to the Parsl documentation now, we have landing points that are clear and they're focused on the activity that someone might want to do. Like, I want to learn about the code, the overview. And I know we've already talked about the overview section being a paper. I have not wanted to touch it yet because I like the content and I know what we need to do is restructure it. So it's been a little behind. But we have things now like I want to know how to write a Parsl app. One short paragraph followed by a description on how one goes deeper, and then dig-ins. Like here is that Python app page I showed you. We've got our rules. We've got our all the way down at the end, the limitations. So hopefully structured in a way that you can glean to the right part of the documentation first and not without having to read as much ahead of time. So I've done that for Parsl apps. Now, what I'm working on now is configuring, because configuring at the present lacks that kind of simple entry point. We've got configuring Parsl, which is about maybe 3 or 4. Oh, okay, no, I was getting it mixed up with execution, which has a lot of subjects in here. It's got elasticity basics, it's got multi-executor, it's got the different execution providers all in one source. Right now, what I'm working on is doing the same sort of treatment of taking this one very dense section and breaking it into those easier entry points and making it clear that even though the ordering here somewhat applies it, like encryption, most people don't need to know about. So I'm making it clear that that's a feature that's one, specific to HTEX, and two, not the thing you should read first. So that's sort of the overall trajectory of where we've been going with these documentation, making them succinct, giving clear entry points, and shuffling content such that it's presented in a flow that allows you to both read it sequentially and dive to where you need to be. So I suppose the two questions for there is one, overall concept. Does that feel like a good strategy? And two, if we're to go back and maybe criticize the Parsl apps section, do we feel that the changes I'm making are achieving that vision?
On this page, yes.
Yeah, luckily Parsl apps is easy, since Parsl itself supports most Python functions. Yeah, I'll need feedback on what the configuring looks like. So if we want to dive into that, I can maybe touch base and introduce people to where the changes are going to be. Unless there are any kind of...
Yeah, do that, do configuring.
Sure. So we're going to go to the recent pull request I opened and hope that the documentation has built on read the docs. I believe I checked that, but I'm having a flash of paranoia. Okay, yep, here we are. So you can see I've been working on this asynchronously for about 2 weeks now. And I'll show you where we're at. Yep, here we are. Please work. Yeah, all right. So configuring Parsl. This here is the part where I find the most new users get tripped up, because building a configuration object requires kind of a tiered set of decisions. What is the config object itself, and how am I going to place that in my overall script? What executor can I choose? And then how do I configure that provider in order to make it such that Parsl will run properly on the nodes? So the way I've started it is taking what content was in execution and breaking it out into according groups. For instance, what was the configuration page lumped inside of the overall, I think this one was in examples. I now have a very short section that configuration is just a list of executors. Try to make it very simple to explain what this thing is. That will capture 90% of the use cases. I talk about using the configuration object to show, hey, please use with. So you don't run into those typical problems of your workflow not finishing before Python exits. And then took the more advanced topic, like you said, it was a list. If I have a list, how do I actually make use of that and why? I put that down at the bottom, focusing also, I should have zoomed in here, focusing on creating the documentation and writing it away, that we have a kind of a clear single, like 5 to 10 word statement for each of the main points we're trying to make. Like all executors define a label that is used to route. So that's sort of the overall writing that I've been doing for this one.
I wonder a
The
little
other,
here
no?
about the flow for many users. Like, I
Yeah.
do agree with you, config is such a pain point, but I think for most
Mhm.
users, the right path should be, hey, go and find a config that someone else has already got for your machine
Yeah.
and change these two variables. And do we want to be routing them more quickly to that? Like, should the path be, you've got to have a config to use Parsl. Strategy 1, your machine already has a well-known config, go and look here. Strategy 2, build your own.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I'm gonna place the go to examples in a call out. So it's a different color. Because
Yeah.
right now it's sort of lost here. Alternatively, start by finding an example configuration. Like that needs to be bolded and maybe even in a box up at the top for you may not need this section.
Yeah,
Go
I mean,
to examples.
I think that is a pretty primary path for us. I would guess more users than not are going and taking an example. Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I think that's exactly what people do. People basically go to the machine's example if they can find it and copy paste it and try to modify it without oftentimes understanding what is going on. But the point is that that's the usual starting point, I think.
Yeah, and that would be my preference too. Like not just is it how I think, and I agree with Yadu, the way that most people are doing things, but that should be the primary route. Like if we made the example configuration page and we've got elements of it here, such that it has a flow chart of like, well, we've got it. I might like polish things up a little bit here, but have your decision tree of, is it your only laptop? HTEX, local provider, no more. But then be able to build people up, like how to teach them how to take Polaris and adjust that to their whims.
Do you think it would make
Do
sense to even have a little service that goes through that? Like you could make a serve, maybe as a student project, make a little service to build a config based on a few questions.
I like that. I mean, that's how I install most like Python codes, if they're anything more than pip. They have those like, what version of Python do you have for PyTorch? Sort of like this. I don't know if everyone has already seen this, and I'm preaching to the choir.
I have not seen it.
Yeah, a couple other codes have it, but you've got your select box. Like
Mhm.
I'm on Linux. I want to build it with
Nice.
Conda. Oh, Ponda no longer available. Ooh, that's spicy. Um, but yeah, normally you could like have it differentiate between these different build conditions,
Yeah,
and it
having
would
something
run
like this to
through.
build a config would be quite cool.
Yeah,
Really, there's not many things. Like, what's your allocation name? What queue do you want to use? What's your Python environment you need to load? You can get most of the way there.
yeah. How many GPUs?
Hmm. It's a good student
Yeah, I
project.
like that. All right, that's on my notes for follow-up. Yeah, I agree. Having something like this would only be visually appealing, and it would, I think, allow people to see the feedback and like, if I click, I want to pin nodes, what setting was it that changed? Like they could flip back and forth and be able to see it visually. For people who don't typically read, okay, never mind, that was a lie. I read a lot of documentation, but for folks who are not ones to sit down and read a bunch of things, I think that would be very handy. Cool. So that's already great feedback on the config documentation. The other area, kind of seeing that we're closing in on a meeting I've got at the end of the hour, which I should prepare for. The one part that I know I need some help with, and this will probably be on a follow-up pull request, is I've taken the executor section and tried to make it clear which parts of the different features of Parsl are applicable under what circumstances. For example, we used to have a single section about resource pinning. That's now, it's only for H text, so it's only under H text. Like all of this stuff about heterogeneous resources. Okay, yes, I need to continue writing here. But we have a work queue / taskvine page. I don't know anything about taskvine, which is something I need to remedy, but probably are not going to in the short time span realistically. I might tap someone who does to help write this section on the short term. Additionally, I imagine we might need something for Globus config here, or sorry, for the Globus executor. Globus compute executor. Is that the abbreviation we're using?
This computer executor. Yeah.
Yeah. So it would be awesome to be able to put that one up, especially since we've pulled away channels. So now making this pretty important. Yeah. The other thing you guys might, I made this stuff up. Someone's going to want to review it. So on the pull request, making sure that I've explained concepts between these different executors, and especially for describing what a job scheduler and a cloud provider need in order to be effective. That's another area that needs technical oversight, which I don't feel comfortable in, but figured I could take a first pass at.
Well, I think Ben's answer here would be this page should disappear
Really? The execution provider?
with the cloud provider part.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not tested.
Yeah.
It is.
Oh, then I'm totally fine with just
Every
murdering it
every
altogether.
mention of cloud ever is accompanied by people being like, "Yeah," the noise yard you just made.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think it is no longer good to have this on. It's
I've been slowly removing the word cloud when I see it.
Cool. I'll do that. That will make me comfortable. What about Kubernetes? Is
Yeah,
Kubernetes first?
Yeah, that's alive at the moment because Globus Compute is using it for some stuff, I think.
Perfect. I made up stuff about Kubernetes that sounded right to my non-container oriented brain.
Yeah.
So I'll axe the cloud provider stuff, but someone needs to review Kubernetes. And I've got this written down on a to-do list somewhere of things specifically to call out once we're at the review stage. Figured I'd announce it now since I've got the pulpit. But yeah, that's basically where I'm at in terms of this configuration overhaul. I do want to solicit some like additional feedback. If there's anything not covered on my overall timeline, if everyone's comfortable with moving away from configuration for now.
I think this all looks good.
All right. So my next beef is I've been using the words job, app, and task interchangeably. And I think we went through a process of formalizing what term goes where. And I might do the pedantic thing of going through and trying to make sure that the documentation obeys what we agreed upon in the glossary, noting that one, our intern did such a great job with it, and two, I saw a bunch of you engaging on the terminology questions. So I figured they're at least better than not vetted.
Yeah. Yeah, I find when I started on Parsl, I found some of the distinction between what's a task and what's a job was not clear.
Yeah. And I want to separate the concept of an app as something
Yeah.
that you call and a task as something that is being running. And I
Yeah.
don't know if we have verbology for that.
I wonder if
Yeah.
we could get rid of the word job entirely. It should never appear as just job. Maybe it should only be batch job, something like
Yeah, it
that.
should only be batch job and
It
it should
should
only
only
be
be
when
batch
we're
job.
talking about providers.
Yeah. Okay, I agree completely on the task versus app distinction. I think we run into that with Globus Compute as well, the function versus task, and we just need to be uniform. That's quite easy. But job, we all use job all the time to mean all sorts of stuff.
All right. Yeah, so I'll go through and try to harmonize our terminology next because following up from there, I want to make a quick start adding, doing some overhaul in the more conceptual parts of the documentation, like making the quick start actually quick, like have a hello world example, which we have more advanced things like the Parsl tutorial, which explains to you how to calculate pi. I want something even dumber. As a way to start out. Then I want to overhaul the overview. And that's about it for things I think I'm going to be doing or have bandwidth to do in like the next 2-3 months. But is there anything that has jumped out to people in the documentation?